Please, everyone, I was going to say a big round of applause. A
Put,
big
put your
welcome.
hands together in your
Get your hands
lounges.
together in your lounges for yourselves to welcome onto the stage Robert Patman, Professor of International Relations down at Otago, is it?
That's correct. Thank you. Good
Yes.
evening.
Connor,
Good
good to have you
evening.
back.
All right.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Some
That's a
exciting
pleasure.
stuff happening overseas. We've seen some talks between, as Chewie just pointed out, Trump being the mediator between Russia and the Ukraine, which is interesting in and of itself. Any thoughts of what you've seen happen in the last 2 days or so?
Well, I think, Emily, it's a permissive understanding of mediation because I think Mr. Trump is pretty aligned with Mr. Putin. And that's why he saw Putin first. And
hmm
he actually is advocating a peace deal which involves the loss of territory which has been annexed by Russia since the invasion of February 2022. So, and what we had today in Washington was Zelensky arriving for his bilateral meeting with Mr. Trump, but also being joined in subsequently, the meeting was expanded to include a number of European leaders, including the head of NATO and leaders such as Macron from France, Merz from Germany, Starmer from Britain, uh, Stubb from Finland, who Finland share this huge border with Russia. And by the way, he has quite a good relationship with Trump, and I think he's constantly telling Trump he shouldn't trust the Russians. So I'm not sure how much he's taking Mr. President Stubb's advice, but it's yeah. So what's coming out of this? I think the Europeans were quite fearful after that meeting at Alaska that
Mm.
Mr. Trump, the president, and his vice president, perhaps his secretary of state, might gang up again against Zelensky. So, what we understand from today's meeting is that, in principle, Mr. Trump is now trying to arrange two things. He's trying to arrange a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin, um, which seems very logical on the face of it because they're the two
hmm
participants in this conflict. One country's invaded the other. So it might be a difficult meeting, not least because Mr. Putin's tried to assassinate Mr. Zelensky at least 3 times. So it'll be interesting to see what Zelensky says to him. Um, and then there's a hope that after the bilateral meeting, if all goes well, that will be expanded into a trilateral meeting involving the president of Russia, the president of Ukraine, and also Mr. Trump, president of the United States. So that's what's panning out. It's interesting, though, there are still open differences between Mr. Trump's vision of peace and that of the Europeans. Merz corrected Trump at one point and said there must be a ceasefire. At the moment, Mr. Trump has, I mean, to give the viewers, listeners, the backdrop to this meeting in Alaska, Mr. Trump had expressed his frustration with Putin's continual bombing of Ukraine, as well as his continual encroachment on the country, and said nothing less than a ceasefire from his meeting from Mr. Putin would suffice. In other words, that was his bottom line. But as soon as he met Putin and laid down the red carpet for him, he suddenly changed his mind, which was a bit bewildering to many other people. And he suddenly adopted the Putin line that there doesn't need to be a ceasefire, there just needs to be a peace agreement, which addresses many of Russia's concerns. Most of those concerns center on retaining not only territory they've actually got in their possession, but also taking control of territory which is not under their control. So I think we have to be a bit skeptical, to sum up, about the prospects for peace at the moment.
Yeah.
I don't doubt the sincerity of all involved, but let's be quite clear. We are talking about a situation whereby one party could bring peace within 12 hours by simply withdrawing his troops to the internationally recognized borders of Russia. That would bring peace. So that's not going to happen. And I have a feeling, I may be wrong, that there'll be backwards and forwards for about a week or so, but I'm not convinced that Mr. Putin wants to meet Zelensky, and let's hope he does, and let's hope they reach some sort of agreement. But it's going to be very difficult, I think, for Zelensky to accept any loss of territory through an illegal occupation of his country. I mean, just imagine how we would feel as a country if we lost part of an island, 2 islands that make our country, and the deal. You know, as somebody put it the other day, Mr. Trump keeps talking about a deal, but is a deal the way to address a situation where one party has transgressed international law? Shouldn't the outcome be that they simply start obeying international law and withdraw their troops back to their own country? I mean, that's logically the thing to do, but I mean, of course, logic and power politics don't always mix together.
Very, very true.
I found a lot of this just not even the negotiating or the meeting itself, but what happened around it to be really interesting. Like the fact that Zelensky didn't walk into this alone this time, that he was surrounded by what they're calling the coalition of the willing, and the fact that it was very much a coordinated charm offensive in the bluntest possible terms, that those guys walked in the room and very clearly had the idea that the way to handle Trump is to just flatter him in the most clumsy, over-the-top way. You know, this wouldn't happen if it wasn't for you, Mr. Trump, all of this sort of stuff. You've mentioned the president of Finland having a great relationship with him based around golf. And so he was the one that was fronting and dropping the big words like this war of aggression that Russia started. I think it shows that there is a united front in Europe. And I think that they are acknowledging that, historically, we have seen this before. If we appease this guy with some territorial gains, he will come back and see more. Whether Trump acknowledges that historical aspect to it for Europe or not, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting. There's been 2 occasions when I've seen Trump very much ill at ease and nervous, and that's been the first big high-profile meeting with Putin in Helsinki in his first administration. That's when a journalist asked Trump whether he believed, the question to Mr. Trump was from a Los Angeles Times journalist was, have you had, do you believe the Russians interfered in the 2016 election? Trump flicked the question to Putin, and Putin said in Russian, no, of course not. And then Trump said he agreed with Putin, and so he overruled all his intelligence services, which has said that the Russians had interfered. This recent meeting in Alaska, I got the distinct feeling watching the 2 of them that it was Mr. Putin who had the swagger, not Trump. And it reminded me of a scene out of The Godfather where the lieutenant is looking after the boss. And I don't know what leverage Mr. Putin's got over Mr. Trump, but it's substantial. I can't quite work out whether it's just sort of hero worship, that Mr. Trump believes that Putin's a really tough guy and he admires him, or whether it goes much further and that there's some other reasons that he just feels he can't stand up to Trump. I mean, we are talking about the most powerful country in the world, which is given Putin, a war criminal, a mass murderer, a global stage. And it's not as if Russia's a superpower. It's not. It's only got an economy the size of Spain's. So it's quite puzzling in many respects. And I think Chewie's right. I think most Europeans are treading carefully in the hope they can gently nudge the President Trump, to a position that aligns with them. I mean, their position is basically that Putin is responsible for this and shouldn't be rewarded in any shape or form. And ultimately, if he doesn't leave, he'll have to be forced out. And I think it's going to be a difficult job to nudge Trump to accept that, because he's always clearly had a very big soft spot for Putin.
Yeah, I often get the sense that Trump thinks that Russia is still the Soviet Union. This massive like opponent to the US that has this enormous army, this massive nuclear arsenal that can go toe to toe with America, and that just hasn't been the case for decades now. But he is still treating it like he is negotiating with the Soviet Union.
You're absolutely right. Interesting to see Lavrov, the foreign minister, arrive with USSR T-shirt, which was a nostalgic throwback to when there was the Soviet Union. And Putin basically does have considerable nostalgia himself for when Russia was the Soviet Union.
As he would. Good times.
Well, and I think most Ukrainians, by the way, it was very interesting reading about opinion in Ukraine in the last 2 days, because it appears that many Ukrainians feel really stabbed in the back by Trump. They were really expecting Trump to come down hard on Putin at that meeting in Alaska and apply what's called the sledgehammer sanctions. These sanctions have been much anticipated, not least by the Ukrainians, because they would have the potential to kill Russia's capacity to continue the war. Why? Because it would involve 500% tariffs on India and China, the countries which buy Russian oil. And Russia is totally dependent on those oil exports. So if these sanctions were applied, it would become unattractive for both India and China to continue buying Russian oil. And that's the idea. And so, and that's why the meeting in Alaska was done at Putin's initiative. And because he's very quick, he's trying to delay sanctions. But, you've got to hand it to Putin. He pulled off a huge win. He put off sanctions. He got Trump to stop talking about a ceasefire. And he's got Trump to basically accept the Russian version of how peace would be achieved. So from his point of view, it was a global success. I think, however, it may be a short-term victory, because I don't think the Europeans and Zelensky are going to go along with how Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin see the outcome.
Yeah, I saw a couple of more military-related announcements from Ukraine. Again, perfectly timed on the day of these negotiations. The Ukrainians unveiled a new cruise missile with an almost 2,000 kilometer range and 1,000 kilogram warhead. So that puts Moscow in range. They also finally put out a commission a Russian oil pipeline, which I believe is the last one crossing their territory. So they've cut that as well. So, I mean, this is one of the things that I've always been fascinated whenever there's peace talks and that sort of thing, is looking at what is going on around it. What you saw a lot of Russian propaganda around this meeting in Alaska, where of course there were these news stories going, did you know in Alaska there's all these Russian Orthodox churches that are very old? I wonder why that is. Did you know that we used to own Alaska? So it's interesting how everybody sort of positions themselves around that sort of peace process or negotiation.
I mean, I think you've raised a really good point. What really struck me is the way that many people in the media, not all, but many people in the media always assume that a small country will be defeated by a big country in a protracted conflict, whereas in fact there's plenty of evidence small countries can and do beat bigger ones. Vietnam, the Soviet Union, Afghanistan. The United States didn't prevail in Iraq when it invaded in 2003. And if you actually stand back a moment, as a former Republican House of Representatives person said today, Putin's not winning. After all, he was supposed to seize the whole of Ukraine within a matter of days when he invaded in 2022. After 3 years, at the cost of more than 1 million Russian casualties, he's got 20% of the country. And he used the example of America's invasion of Iraq to illustrate the point. He said, just imagine, if we had invaded, as they did, Iraq in March 2003, and after 3 years, we'd only had 20% of the country, would we be seeing, and lost 1 million troops, would we be saying that's a great success? No, we wouldn't. But the dominant narrative is that Russia is winning. And you mentioned those missiles in the pipeline. I think the longer this goes on, the more difficult it's going to be for the Russians, not the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, of course, do face real shortages of people to fight, because they're a much smaller country. They're still about 43 million, so they're quite a substantial country, but Russia's more than 140 million, so there's a bit of an imbalance there. But if they continue to get help from the Europeans, who have stepped up their game recently, I do think the Ukrainians have shown themselves to be fighting what analysts called asymmetrical war. They're not trying to fight the war on Russia's terms. They're trying to use drones. They're the world leader now in drones. And every night, and it's not hitting the headlines, they're hitting key points of Russian infrastructure. In the last
military
week,
targets.
Oil installations. Russia's lost, I think it's between 5 and 10% of its oil refining capacity in this year alone. So this is going to have a cumulative effect, because Russia's economy is in real trouble. It's stopped growing, and the inflation is rising. And in addition, interest rates are skyrocketing. And many Russian consumers are extremely upset about the shortages of things in the shops. So they have up to now relied heavily on China to support them. And but it seems to me that going forward, this idea that there must inevitably be territorial concessions is quite worrying, because I've heard a lot of journalists, both in the US and Europe, saying, well, Zelensky's going to have no choice. He's going to have to just concede that territory. And I don't actually see it that way, because I think it's a very bad precedent when someone uses force to change borders. If you look at it from the point of view of our country, we have a big stake in Putin failing, because should he succeed in getting the principle that might is right, that makes our life very difficult, particularly since China's one of the biggest backers of Russia. And the danger is that China may be emboldened by the example of Putin effectively stealing land from a neighbor and getting away with it.
Yeah.
And that's a big worry for smaller countries, which we do depend on rules and laws internationally, and so do countries like Australia and Canada, in a way that the bigger players like China and the United States don't. So there's quite a lot of it, although it's geographically a long way away, it's also close to home, because some of the key actors, such as China and India, are actually backing Russia in this conflict, which is, so if Putin gets what he wants, it will have implications for our neighborhood.
Yeah, for sure. There was, I don't want to keep you here, you've already given us quite a bit of time, which I really appreciate. There was just one other thing that came out of this last 2 days, and that was the Coalition of the Willing had a virtual call in between when Putin and Trump met in today's happenings in the White House. And there was a bit of a fuss because Luxon didn't appear to the 1 a.m. scheduled virtual meeting and instead sent some officials. Does that look bad for us if we didn't send our Prime Minister? I don't know whether or not I couldn't find information on who else was on that call other than the countries stated. but I don't think it looked great. I don't know. What's your opinion on that
Well,
one?
my view is it's a very important issue for this country for the reasons we've just gone through. And to be fair, both the Ardern and Hipkins-led Labour governments and now the Luxon government have been very supportive of Ukraine and certainly take the European interpretation that Ukraine's territorial integrity and state sovereignty should be preserved in the outcome of this conflict. If it's settled, it should be done on the basis that respects the territory and the sovereignty of Ukraine. So I take it from what you've just told me, it was actually officials, that public servants who. I
Yeah.
don't think that's good. I mean, I would have thought at the very least, either Mr. Peters or the defense minister should be present. We do need. There's a tendency in this country to assume, because we're a long way away from everyone, that it doesn't really matter. People don't notice our absence, but they do. And it's a shame because we've actually been very supportive of Ukraine. We've contributed more than 135 million in humanitarian and military aid since the Russian invasion. We've always been outspoken in our opposition to the Russian invasion. But that on the face of it, and not knowing the circumstances, I'm disappointed that the Prime Minister, didn't sit in for it. Was a Zoom meeting, I would assume, or something like that.
Yeah.
Teams meeting or something.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that's disappointing if that's the case. I don't know the full circumstances, but on the face of it, it does seem disappointing. Yes.
No, that is interesting. No. Anything else, Chewie? Very, very quickly, and we'll let Robert head off.
There was a question in here for you. Yes. Max asks, do you think, Robert, that we might see an invasion into one or some of the Baltic states? They are certainly gearing up heavily for war in appearance. I guess that would be your Lithuanias, and I guess at the other end of the scale, Poland is obviously, Lithuania and Estonia and Poland is gearing up in a massive way.
And so's Germany. I know Germany's further removed, but it's a very important country in Central Europe, or Western Europe, but very, very centered. I do think it's a really good question. I think countries like Finland and Sweden, which have traditionally been neutral, have now joined NATO. So they're extremely alarmed by the sense of impunity by which Putin has acted. And I think actually people closer to Russia take the view that he's not interested in any peaceful outcome. He's only interested in an outcome in which he achieves his goals. That is to say, he'll accept a diplomatic outcome if he can get the territories he wants. And of course, Crimea as well as part of eastern Ukraine. But I think many of those countries in the Baltic states, I remember talking recently to a colleague who's a professor at the University of Lithuania, and she was complaining that many of the countries in the Western world, and she included America here, were completely naive about Putin. And they said that Putin once described the collapse of the Soviet Union as a geopolitical catastrophe. And so I think people like Lavrov and Putin, who formative years were spent in the Soviet Union, I think their understanding of a great power is for Russia to reestablish itself, not just in Ukraine, but in neighboring countries. And that's been a historic goal going back to the Tsars. So I think the question is on point, because I think the big fear for the Europeans, and I certainly picked this up when I was in Germany in January, is that if Putin gets any sort of reward for his aggression in Ukraine, it will inevitably lead to pushing his luck elsewhere. It might be making territorial demand. I mean, what Mr. Trump is not really addressing at the moment, let's just say, for example, hypothetically, and this answers the sort of question that's been raised. Mr. Putin got what he wanted for regions of Ukraine plus Crimea. That's what he wants. And let's say we had an agreement in which that was agreed. 6 months later, Trump suddenly picks up the phone and says to President Trump, actually, I've decided I need a little bit more territory, or I need an enclave of Baltic states. And given his success in taking what he wanted before, he may be tempted to repeat the trick. So I do think, as we said earlier in this discussion, that many of the countries are looking at the outcome of the Ukraine conflict and seeing their fate linked to it. And yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is that I have a feeling that if Putin started really making progress on the battlefield, and he's not making much progress, he's making slow progress, but taking very heavy casualties in the process. But should he sort of suddenly make a breakthrough, I think some of the surrounding countries might be tempted to intervene. But that hasn't happened yet. Yeah, I think the question is very much relevant. I think the countries surrounding Ukraine basically will only be satisfied with Putin's defeat because they'll see anything else as a threat, a potential threat to themselves.
Yeah.
I have seen one point of view put forward that Putin can't put this back in the toothpaste back in the tube because he's transitioned his country into a war economy. If they go out of that and their military industrial machinery sort of goes, oh, well, we're not replacing what we've lost. Well, we've got no work. And then you get all of these soldiers come back as well, looking for work, looking for money, and it's not there, and the country falls apart. So it's kind of like, well, this is our last chance and we can't back down.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of persuasiveness in that argument because I don't think, for Mr. Putin, he has no choice but to continue to pursue his objectives in Ukraine. He can't really withdraw. If he withdraws, he'll probably lose his life. He's not going to have a comfortable retirement in Crimea. He's murdered many of his opponents, and there's a lot of people hurting in Russia who will be looking to get their revenge when an opportunity presents it. It was very close to a coup last year in 2024 when Yevgeny Prigozhin moved against Putin. We don't know the exact circumstances why Prigozhin called off the coup, although it was going very successfully at first. But we do know he paid with his life when he called it off. Within 2 months, he was dead. And that's usually the fate for most people who have political ambitions, who seriously trouble Putin's power position. Also, unfortunately, means being an independent journalist in Russia is very dangerous as well.
They have a lot of unsafe windows.
Yeah, very unsafe windows. But coming back to your point, I think, Putin's got from his point of view, it's all or nothing. He must get those territories. If he fails to do so, I think one of his entourage may decide that they can do a better job than Putin at being Putin. So I don't know, but it seems to me he is, by invading Ukraine, he took a tremendous gamble. I don't think the gamble in the long term is going to work. But of course, for his nightmare was, why did he do it? He often points to NATO enlargement, but I think it had a lot to do with trying to run an authoritarian system, which he'd been in charge of for more than 25 years. And he was very worried about the developments in Ukraine, given the linguistic and people-to-people connections between the two countries. The thing that really frightens dictators is living next door to a democracy that is growing in confidence. And his nightmare scenario would be that young Russians would demand what young Ukrainians were experiencing, which was the ability to vote. It won't be lost to Russians, that young Russians, that while Putin's been in power, Ukraine's had 6 leaders. So, these sort of things do matter to dictators. And I think, he's taken a tremendous gamble. He probably thought it would work, that he could quickly eliminate or decapitate the Zelensky regime, take over the country. Whether he had the economic capacity to run Ukraine as well as Russia is another matter. But it looks like that gamble is unraveling, and I think it's a long way from being over. But I hope the peace initiative works. But to me, it's difficult. I can't see where the wiggle room is for Putin to make big concessions from his point of view, because authoritarian leaders, they often kill people to hang on to power, which means they're also vulnerable to the same process when their grip on power weakens.
Absolutely. No, it'd be interesting to see if anything comes of this. I think we're always hopeful, and time again we don't see much. But I guess we're all rooting for Ukraine, and hopefully something will come of the coalition of the willing, and hopefully we can do a very, very, very small part. But it's good to know that we're on board, and maybe our Prime Minister might show up next time. You've been very,
if
very
they schedule it
generous.
at a more convenient time.
If it's not at 1 o'clock in the morning, he needs his beauty sleep. You've been very generous with your time. We really appreciate your
Thanks,
expertise
Emily.
in this particular matter.
Thanks,
But we'll let
Julie.
you head off to your evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye for now.